All right, let's dive right into today's explainer, where we're unpacking one of the absolutely most compelling and vital human rights stories of the late 20th century. We are looking at the incredible, almost unbelievable journey of Rigoberta Menchú. Here's a woman who was born into extreme poverty in the Guatemalan highlands, yet she somehow rose to become a massive international symbol of indigenous resistance, survival, and justice. We're going to trace exactly how her own life story is deeply, inextricably tied to both the suffering and the profound resilience of the Maya people. It's kind of a staggering thought, right? How does one single voice rise above a literal genocide? The stakes here could not possibly be higher. During an incredibly dark period in Latin American history, millions of people were being subjected to extreme violence and just forced into silence. But Rigoberta Menchú, she had a very specific superpower. She simply spoke the truth. She used her voice as her ultimate instrument of resistance, right? When speaking up was, without a doubt, the most dangerous thing a person could possibly do. Section 1. Roots of Maya Inequality, the Climate Before the Crisis. So, to really wrap our heads around the magnitude of what she accomplished, we first have to understand the severe, built-in divide that defined Guatemalan society way before the Civil War even started. On one side, you've got wealthy, elite landowners. To put this massive disparity into perspective, historically, about 2% of the population controlled roughly 70% of the country's productive land. Let that sink in. On the other side, you have the deeply impoverished indigenous peasants. Menchú herself belonged to the Quiché Maya people, and families like hers faced just relentless systemic racism, extreme poverty, and severe land inequality. Just to survive, indigenous peasants were forced to migrate seasonally, dealing with brutal conditions, and scraping by on incredibly low wages on coffee and cotton plantations. Menchú literally watched children dying from malnutrition and workers being routinely abused. This stark, everyday reality is exactly what shaped her political consciousness from a very young age. And that kind of severe social inequality, it's a powder keg. By 1954, deeply entangled in Cold War paranoia, a CIA-backed coup actually overthrew Guatemala's reformist president, Jacobo Arbenz. This sparked massive destabilization, and by 1960, a brutal civil war officially kicked off. For the next 36 years, the whole country was just torn apart by fighting between leftist guerrilla groups and right-wing military dictatorships. The conflict steadily escalated, culminating in these horrifying military campaigns in the 1980s, before finally winding down with the peace accords in 1996. Moving to Section 2, the Guatemalan Genocide Crisis, the 1980s Scorched Earth campaigns. Now, let's zoom in on the early 1980s. These were the absolute deadliest years of the Civil War, overseen primarily by the military dictator Efraín Ríos Montt. The devastation here reached unimaginable levels. I actually want to pause for a second and just let the sheer horror of this number sink in. 200,000. More than 200,000 people died during the Guatemalan Civil War. Behind every single digit in that number is a human life, a family, a community that was completely shattered. And when you actually break down that massive death toll, a horrifying reality becomes clear. While leftist guerrillas were fighting the government, the military actively targeted civilians they suspected of helping the rebels. So the indigenous Maya population became the primary victims of the state, making up an overwhelming 83% of the total casualties. We're talking about the military unleashing systematic scorched earth tactics against these civilian communities. If you're not familiar, a scorched earth campaign essentially means destroying absolutely everything that might be useful to an enemy: crops, homes, infrastructure, and people, leaving nothing but ashes. Entire villages were literally wiped off the map. This violence wasn't just accidental crossfire, it was highly ruthlessly intentional. It included mass killings, horrific instances of torture and rape, forced disappearances where people would just vanish into the night, the total physical destruction of indigenous villages, and massive forced displacement. So the absolutely crucial point here is that when historians and truth commissions eventually analyzed these specific targeted atrocities, they didn't just call it a war. They concluded that the Guatemalan state's actions against the indigenous Maya populations fit the exact definition of genocide, the deliberate destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Section 3. Tragedy, Resistance, and Exile. Menchú's Personal Crucible. For Rigoberta Menchú, this enormous national crisis wasn't just happening in the background. It was an intensely personal, heart-wrenching tragedy. The genocide devastated her own family in ways that are genuinely hard to even comprehend. The military kidnapped, tortured, and killed her younger brother. Her mother was abducted, violently assaulted, and murdered. Her father, Vicente, died in 1980 during the burning of the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City after security forces violently attacked protesters inside the building. It is a level of personal loss that is frankly almost unimaginable. Extreme trauma like that, it breaks most people. But for Menchú, it became the ultimate catalyst for nonviolent activism. Facing enormous personal risk, she organized peasant and indigenous communities. She advocated fiercely for workers' rights and began loudly denouncing military violence. But by 1981, speaking out essentially became a definitive death sentence, forcing her to flee into exile in Mexico. Which brings us to Section 4, Awakening the World, Finding Her Voice. Because exile definitely wasn't the end of her activism, it was really the launch pad for her global reach. Displaced from her homeland, she chose to bypass armed conflict and focus heavily on international awareness. And that brings us to 1983, a massive turning point, when her life story was published as a memoir titled I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian Woman in Guatemala. What's so incredible about this book is that Menchú actually dictated it over a series of interviews because she had only recently learned to speak Spanish, having grown up primarily speaking her native Quiché. This memoir was a total breakthrough. It brought the grim, unfiltered reality of Guatemala's massacres and state-sponsored repression right into the living rooms of a global audience, a world that, largely because of Cold War politics, had really preferred to just ignore what was happening. The impact of this memoir, literally impossible to overstate. For a lot of folks outside of Latin America, it was the very first detailed account they had ever encountered of the genocide. Now, to be fully transparent, later on, the book did spark some scholarly debates regarding the specifics of a few personal anecdotes. But as critics and supporters alike acknowledged, the broader reality it presented, the vibrant Maya culture, the undeniable military brutality, and the deeply personalized suffering of the indigenous people, was absolutely tragically true. It essentially grabs the globe by the shoulders and forced it to pay attention. And guess what? The world did pay attention. In 1992, Rigoberta Menchú was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, specifically recognized for her pursuit of social justice and ethno-cultural reconciliation based on respect for the rights of indigenous peoples. This was a profoundly historic moment. She was the very first indigenous person from the Americas to receive this award. It formally recognized and validated the suffering of indigenous peoples across Latin America on literally the highest global stage possible. Section 5. A Legacy of Justice. Beyond the Peace Accords. So, what happens after the whole world starts paying attention? Well, in 1996, the Guatemalan Peace Accords were finally signed, but Menchú's work was far from over. Her historical impact is just immense and multi-layered. She brought unprecedented international attention to a marginalized people. She relentlessly exposed the massive scale of violence during the Civil War. She proved that survivors can fight for justice without surrendering to hatred or armed conflict. And she expanded the entire global discussion on human rights law and cultural identity. She even threw her weight behind international legal cases against former military leaders accused of crimes against humanity. And she went on to found the Wenoch political party to make sure indigenous voices actually stay in government. Survival, resistance, speaking truth to terror. That is her legacy. She remains a fiercely powerful champion for the Maya people, a woman who repeatedly put her own life on the line to tell the world the undeniable truth, exactly when so many others were silent or forced into hiding. Because Rigoberta Menchú's story isn't just dusty history locked in the past. It's a living, ongoing blueprint for human rights advocacy. So we really have to ask ourselves, how will the world continue to answer the call for indigenous rights and justice today? Her activism challenges us to look at where forced silence still exists right now and asks if we have the courage to speak truth to it. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked this incredible history. Stay curious, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.